Okay. We're recording. We're on air. Okay. Boker Tov, Shabbat Tov, everyone. So we had a bit of a break for Chanukah, an extended break, because 2 weeks ago we had a shiur, but the shiur was on Hilchot Chanukah, if you remember, and then last week there was no shiur. So it's been a while since we were discussing Hilchot Bishul. What's that? We're not doing Purim now. No. We're not a bakery. You know, the joke that, the bakeries in Israel, it's like, the day after Chanukah, even the 8th day of Chanukah, they're already making us Haman. There's no in between. Okay. So we are on working our way through volume 18 of the Tzurba Rabbanan series. Volume 21, I think, is in preparation at the moment. So just so you know, we've got a way to go. We are towards the end of the 4th shiur, so we'll pick it up on page 180, 190 maybe. But we've got up to 197. That's where we got up to. We've spoken about Shehiyah, we've spoken about Chazara, we spoke about Hanacha, we spoke about hot plates and warming drawers. Okay, that was where we left off, if you remember. If you don't remember, refer you to the book and refer you to YouTube. But that's where we got up to. There's now another 2 topics, interesting topics to talk about, just to close off the section before we move on to the final rabbinic decree regarding Bishul, which we'll discuss, which is Hatmana, which is insulation. But before we get there, so first of all, there's an interesting topic, and both of these come up fairly often, relating to, you see at the top of page 197, adding hot water to prevent a fully cooked food from burning. Now, in truth, this topic really we should have discussed earlier. The reason it's been placed here is just because in the order of the Shulchan Aruch, this is mentioned together. You'll see it's in Siman Reish Nun Gimel, which is together with Chazara and Shehiyah and all of that, which is why we talk about it here. But it really relates more to Bishul D'Oraita than to anything else. Okay, and the scenario is this. The scenario is you wake up on Shabbos morning and you go down to the kitchen and you see you've got the smell of cholent that's going through the house, which is very nice, but you look at the pot and you see that it's starting to burn and it's run out of water and it's getting dry. The question is, can you add water into the pot on Shabbat? Okay, so this is not a question, it's a more severe question. It's not a question of an Isur D'Rabbanan of Shehiyah or Chazara, but it's a question of Bishul. Okay, because if you're going to take, certainly if I take cold water and I add it now into a hot cholent pot, so then I'm cooking the water. What if the water was already hot? What if the water had already been boiled and then cooked down? So I'm re-cooking cooked water, so to speak. Okay, so that's the discussion. And the source for this we have in the Ran, source number 48, you'll see, the Ran in Masechet Shabbat, commenting on the Rif. He brings the opinion of Rabbeinu Yonah, and he actually holds differently from the opinion of Rabbeinu Yonah. So let's see. So Rabbeinu Yonah says that the Ran, quoting the Rabbeinu Yonah, says as follows. Says Arav Rabbeinu Yonah Zal Katav. There is a great stumbling block. Many people get this wrong, he says. Again, this is Rabbeinu Yonah speaking now. So what do people do? This was in the days before they had, urns and, Shabbos kettles with fancy switches and things that never work. But they did it the old-fashioned way. So you have a kettle, a pot of hot water, and you insulate it. Okay, insulation, Hatmana, it's the next topic. How are you allowed to do that? With what materials are you allowed to insulate? We'll get to all of that. It's also going to have implications in terms of hot plates and some of the things that we do. But in any event, so the point is, they would take this pot of water and this kettle, they would keep the water hot. Why? In order they could litain Shabbat. When you see that the food is getting dry, so you would add hot water to it. So says Rabbeinu Yonah, now in bold, the bold is a modern edition. He says, "Pe'amim sha'echad ein yad soledet bo, v'achel yad soledet bo mitbashel zeh b'zeh." Okay, what's the problem? You're insulating it as best as you can, but the water's going to cool down, or the pot's going to cool down, whichever one it is. And what's going to happen? You're going to mix the two. The one is boiling, and the other one is not. One is yad soledet, one is below yad soledet. So when they come into contact, the food and the water, whichever one is cooler, is actually going to be cooked by the one which is hotter, and that's going to be a prohibition. As we said, we're back into the Isur D'Oraita, not an Isur D'Rabbanan. So that's very severe. So that's number one. He says, "V'nimtzeu mevashlim b'Shabbat." Says you're cooking on Shabbat, right? as we've learned many times, cooking is not just if you have the pot on the stove, but if you have the heat, cooking can take place on your plate, can take place in your bowl, can take place in many different forms. Now he says, even if both are boiling, we may still have a problem. How so? You remember we discussed this way back when we spoke about Kli Rishon, Kli Sheni, Kli Shlishi, etc. And we have a concept of Irui. There was a big question, what is Irui? So, right, Kli Rishon is when something is in the pot. Kli Sheni is something is in the pot. It's not the pot that was on the fire, it's the next pot. Okay. But Irui is when I pour I pour from the pot. So when I'm pouring from a Kli Rishon onto a plate, onto a bowl, whatever, what is the status of the pouring? There are those who say that Irui is like where it comes from. It's still like the Kli Rishon. There are those who say, no, it's not. It's no longer the Kli Rishon. It's now like the Kli Sheni when I'm pouring and the heat cools down, etc. So he says, according to the opinion that says Irui, not Kli Rishon, Ksheme'alina mayim le'atar she'atzu min hakli, af al pi she'en ultchin. So the water's still boiling. That's true. But now we're looking not at the physical definitions, but the halachic definitions. So when I pour it from the Kli Rishon, I'm not placing, it's not water from a Kli Rishon, it's Irui from a Kli Rishon. And therefore, pasak koach retichatan milevashel, kedin Kli Sheni, she'eno mevashel, umitbashlin betoch Kli Rishon. In other words, he's saying that now when I pour it I take this water and I pour it in, once it's left the kettle, so it's now Irui, so it no longer has the heat of Kli Rishon, and it now comes into contact with the Kli Rishon, because the pot of cholent or whatever it is on the fire, and therefore I'm now cooking the water again, even if it's hot. So my first concern is in terms of the heat of the water. My second concern is in terms of the halachic states of the water. But either way, says Rabbi Yonah, I'm concerned that you can't do this because you're essentially cooking the water. Over the page, at top of 198, it says, so that is the opinion of the Rabbi Yonah, right? That the Ran is quoting. Now the Ran himself says, says, I don't know what he's talking about. He says, you're coming up with chumras. Everybody's got chumras. But no, there's no problem. He says, the Mishnah which we learned right at the beginning when we discussed Bishul, right? The Mishnah says, anything that was placed in chamin, anything that was already in hot water before Shabbat, i.e. anything that was cooked before Shabbat, sholin oto b'chamin b'Shabbat, you can soak it in hot water again on Shabbat. I.e. there is no bishul acha bishul, af al pi shu tzonen gamur, even though it's completely cold. In other words, says the Ran, I don't know what your problem is, Rabbeinu Yonah, because we have a principle of ein bishul acha bishul. Once it's been cooked, it's not going to be cooked again. So once your water's been heated up, even if it cools down, I can pour it on and can cook again. Problem is, as we know, that we paskin that certainly when it comes to liquids, right, we paskin that we do say bishul acha bishul. So when it comes to liquids, when it comes to water, it will be a problem for us. So the Ran says, fresh, ben mayim vushalim, limvushal acher, v'tzorchiyun bdika. Okay, he says, I don't understand, the Ran here is lenient, but you'll see the Shulchan Aruch, not surprisingly, he holds like the Rabbeinu Yonah here. He says, yesh limchot, b'yad hanoagim. Right? The Shulchan Aruch starts off, he says, we should protest. Okay? Protest against those who have this minhag, right? Basically quoting the Rabbeinu Yonah, Latmin mibod yom kumkum shamayim chamin, v'nonin otam latoch hakdera b'Shabbat kshatavshir mitztamek. Okay, this says the Shulchan Aruch, this protest, interesting language here. It doesn't say tasur, it says yesh limchot. It says there is a practice and we have to protest against it. Seemingly this is not proper, this is not correct. So up to this point, it would seem to be that we would say that to pour water, to add water onto the cholent. Okay, the first thing, again, we have to remember, all of this is only talking about a case where the food is fully cooked already. If the food inside the pot is not fully cooked, so just taking off the lid and putting the lid back on, that itself, we saw, would already that be considered hastening the cooking, and that would be a problem. And then adding boiling water onto the food which is not cooked, so you're cooking the food in that way, so that would be an issue. But if it's fully cooked already, again, and our concern now is not cooking the food, but our concern is about cooking the water, essentially, when the water comes into contact with the boiling food. So according to the Shulchan Aruch, it seems to be that there is a problem. However, certainly for Ashkenazim, we have a leniency here that might apply, even if even if the water is not boiling, we may still have a leniency, which is the following. You remember when we discussed Ein bishul achar bishul or yesh bishul achar bishul. Again, just to get us back, it's been a long time, so just to get back into the concepts. We said like this. We said that we assume the basic understanding of most of the Rishonim, and we saw it in the Ran, is that there is no bishul achar bishul. Once the food has been cooked, it cannot be cooked again. And this is all we're talking on a d'oraita level. We then said, because there are some Rishonim, and out of deference to that opinion, we say that when it comes to a liquid, we assume that liquid can be cooked again. I'm not going to go now into all the sfarot and all the technicalities of why we said that. However, the Ramah said something very, very confusing. The Ramah said when it came to putting food back, right, he said that if I have a liquid which is cooled down, okay, and if I want to put it back onto the fire, again, I'm now only talking in terms of bishul, I'm not talking in terms of chazara and all those other conditions which have been discussed, but only in terms of bishul. So once the food has dropped to below yad soledet bo, says the Shulchan Aruch, you cannot place a liquid that is below yad soledet bo on the fire on Shabbat. Where it's going to, why? Because below yad soledet bo it's uncooked, and once it gets to yad soledet bo it's cooked, and therefore uncooked. Says the Ramah, okay, he said if it went below yad soledet bo, so long as it is not cooled completely, so long as the food is still warm. And where do we find this Geder and Halakha and Chot Bishul that it's still warm? And this is a major point of contention amongst the Achronim. What did the Ramah mean? And what's he saying? But he says, so long as it's still warm, you're allowed to put it back, even if it's not Yad Soledet Bo, and it's not considered cooking. Okay, so there are those who say, what does the Ramah mean? There are those who say that essentially the Ramah holds Ikar Adin and holds that there is not Bishul Achar Bishul, it's only a stringency. There are other ways of explaining it as well. There was the Chazon Ish, the Egletal, etc. But the bottom line is, says the Ramah, this is the way that we paskin, that if the food, again, we're dealing with a liquid that was cooked in the first place, and it's now cooled down somewhat, but so long as it is not cooled completely, even though it's not yad soledet bo, the Ramah says you can put it back on the fire, and that is not considered cooking. So based on that, says the Magen Avraham over here, again, this was all in this siman, by the way, it's a while since we saw it, but he says in source number 50, it says, Pamim, right, that was Rabbeinu Yonah's first concern. He said, what if the one's yad soledet, the one's not yad soledet? So he says, what we see later on, we see in the Hilchot Bishul, says the Ramah, so he says, therefore over here, this would be allowed as well. Okay, again, this is obviously only where the water was boiled in the first place, and the water was already cooked, and it's still a little bit warm. If it's completely cold water that's never been boiled, then that's clear that's going to be forbidden. That one would not be allowed to do. Okay. The second point here, we saw, well, what about this idea of Irui, of Kli Rishon, or even Kli Sheni? So let's look now at some of the contemporary poskim, how they address this. Pnei Lacha, source number 51. I can tell you, by the way, the Shul has just purchased a set of the entire Pnei Halacha of what exists until now. It's going to be delivered sometime this week, so look for that downstairs if you want to have a look at those books. I think there's about, I don't remember, I think something like 18 volumes on all sorts of different topics. By the way, the entire Sefer as well is available. Rav Melamed is, say this lishvach. Sometimes people write books, and it's only if you buy the book, you can learn from the book. If you don't buy the book, you can't use it. So the entire volume, the entire series of Pnei Halacha is available online. There's a website, there's an app as well. You can download, and anybody can access it for free. Obviously, it's a lot more comfortable to have the actual book in front of you and to learn from it, and that's why the shul has recently purchased them. So in any event, source number 51. Says Pnei Halacha over here. He says, "Kasher nozlim shebikderat achamin shal plata itnatfu." So we have a cholent pot right that's on the hot plate, and it's evaporating. You're concerned it's going to burn. Yesh chashash tavshil yisaref. Asur losif likdera mayim kalim. You certainly cannot add cold water to the pot. That's completely forbidden. You're cooking the cold water, and that would be that's forbidden, as we said. But what if you have on the hot plate you have an urn? Okay, so the first example he gives, he says you have an urn on the plata, and then he says mutar le'alot mimeno mayim chamim el toch ha'ktela. You can pour directly from the hot water into the pot. V'im yesh lo mecham belez He says, alternatively, if I have an urn, I could take the pot, place it underneath the urn, and pour water directly from the urn into the pot. In such a situation, so long as I'm still holding the pot and I'm intending to put it back, then that would be okay. Now, let's say you have a very large cholent pot, all right, or the urn is very heavy, whatever, you can't pour from one directly to the other. It's not always so practical. So he says, so here's a chiddush. He says, in such a case, you could pour the water into a cup, and then you could pour the cup into the pot. Why is that a chiddush? Because essentially we're saying not only is this not heroically rishon, but this is heroically sheni. So he says, "Kol zman shayad tzolel mechom hamayim ledat ruach machleh shel haposkim ein b'misul bishul." Says so long as the water is still yad tzolelet bo. So the vast, which is the case here, the vast majority of poskim would say it's not cooking. V'kach nagim ov Yisrael b'chalam etzei Ashkenaz, Teiman u'Tzfon Africa. Okay, and that is apparently the practice of the communities of Ashkenaz, Yemen, and North Africa. Okay, but you see, he does say as well that one should ideally pour directly from the Kli Rishon. And only if it's not possible, does he mention the Kli Sheni, 39 Melachot, the Grey Book, Melachos, the Grey Book, right, says the same, Rav Ribiat, he says, if one discovers the fully cooked cholent has dried up in the pot, he may add hot water from an urn or kettle, which is Kli Rishon, to the pot of cholent. The water should come directly from the urn or kettle into the pot, not from a Kli Sheni. Okay, but then he says, if necessary, one may add water to the pot, even from a Kli Sheni. For example, if the water is in an electric urn, that cannot be brought to the pot, and the pot's too heavy, right? And that's what we're saying. According to some views, this is not the preferred method, should be used only when there is no other practical alternative. Okay, all this is according to Ashkenazim. This is one of those cases, as we saw, the Sfarim are a little bit more machmir. See the Yalkut Yosef over the page? He says, Tafshila monach ala plata v'nitztamek asur latei b'tocho mayim olchim b'Shabbat. So he says, no, one cannot pour hot water into it on Shabbat. That's the advice which is given in the Shulchan Aruch, right? Which is brought in the Rishonim already. We saw this previously, where he says if you wake up and you find that your plate it's burning, so you can move it to a lower heat source, right? So it's on the platter, so you take it off, you put a pot on top, so it's in order that it's not directly on and it won't burn as much. That is what the Yalkut Yosef recommends. But bottom line, as we saw, certainly according to the Ashkenazim, if one has boiling water, which one wants to add to the hot cholent, that would be permissible. Okay. There is another case that comes up, another interesting question. We spoke about the case where one can or cannot take my cooked food, and again place it on the hot plate.
I gotta finish with it.
And if it's solid food, right? There are some who would even allow one to take that out from the fridge on Shabbat morning and place it directly on the hot plate. Many poskim are more concerned about that because of michzik and bashel and other reasons. And therefore, we said if you have an inverted pan or a pot and you place it with a separation and it's recognizable that it's not going straight on, then that would also be okay. All that is relating to solid food. Relating to liquid food is more problematic because there's an issue of bishul, as we've been saying. Cold liquid food I cannot take and put onto the hot plate on Shabbat morning. I think we discussed briefly as well the idea if I have sauce which is congealed, for example, so it was a liquid food, right now it's solid, and therefore based on that I put it on, it's a solid food, that would be okay. In that case, Ashkenazim are concerned about the prohibition of nolad, that and therefore if you have sauce, so if it's on rice or something where it's not going to be recognizable, it's going to be absorbed once it melts, that would circumvent that problem. Now, so there's another question. Let's say for whatever reason one doesn't have a pot, or one doesn't follow the hold that one can place it straight onto the hot plate. There's a question. Sometimes you have the timer, so you have your hot plate which is off, and the question is, can I take the food that I put from the fridge, place it on the timer, place it on the hot plate when the hot plate is off? So essentially, I haven't done anything, but the timer is going to come on, then it's going to come on later, right? Is that equivalent to placing the food on the hot plate? Or is that equivalent to doing nothing? And then that should be permitted. That's an interesting question that comes up, which the contemporary poskim discuss. Now, where are we going to find a precedent for this sort of thing? So where we look, we have a case what might be equivalent, or to a certain extent, is if you were, because what are we saying? We're saying you're achieving the result of heating up the food, but I'm not actually placing it on the fire myself. So let's say a person was to ask a non-Jew to place the food on top of the fire, right? Would that may or may not be equivalent? So we have this discussion in the Pri Megadim, page 201. The Biur Halacha quotes the Pri Megadim, who says the following. He says, "Kaivan de kaimalan de shvut letzorech Shabbat shali lekatchila." We have a principle of shvut, right? Shvut means that it's an isur d'Rabbanan. So Amira Lenochri, which we'll discuss in greater detail in later Shiurim, but Amira Lenochri itself is an isur d'Rabbanan. That's a shvut. From the Torah, biblically, one would be allowed to ask a non-Jew to perform malacha, but Rabbanan said you can't do that. Different reasons are given for that, at least 3 different reasons why that is. Is it because we assume l'chumra, that there is shlichut for the non-Jew? Is it part of the prohibition of v'daber davar? There's certain things we aren't allowed to talk about on Shabbat. One's not allowed to talk about melachot that one's going to do after Shabbat on Shabbat. Right? I'm not allowed to say that. And therefore, in the same way, asking, telling, hinting to a non-Jew to perform malacha on Shabbat may fall under that category. Or it may be to do with the fact that it's a zilzul of Shabbat, that Shabbat's going to come to be light in our eyes and what it's going to lead to, whatever the reason is. But there's an isur d'Rabbanan of telling a non-Jew to perform melacha. If the melacha which I'm asking him to perform is also an isur d'Rabbanan, so that's a shvut to shvut. That's a double d'Rabbanan. Now that's still forbidden. However, if it's for a tzorech mitzvah, then it could be permitted. So he says, he says, there's another discussion in the poskim when we say shvut to shvut tzorech mitzvah. Do we mean specifically the shvut to shvut of Amira Lenochri, or would that mean any shvut to shvut, any double rabbanon? Okay, that's also a discussion. But in any event, he says, shvut to shvut tzorech Shabbat shal lekatchila, u'b'davar yavesh ed bo lak shvut to chazara. If we're dealing with a dry food, all right, so it's only an isur d'Rabbanan. There's no isur bishul of cooking. A dry food, it's only an isur of chazara, which is an isur d'Rabbanan. And therefore, if you were to ask the non-Jew to place that on, he says, they know you and He says it's possible that would be permitted. Okay, now the Chazon Ish has a slightly different shita on this. The Chazon Ish understands the following: that when we're talking about chazara and putting the food on the fire and all these decrees, it's not just about the action which I'm doing, but it's about achieving the result. In any situation where that result is going to be achieved in that forbidden way, I have a responsibility to prevent that from happening. And therefore, he would not allow this. Have a look at source number 55. He says, in other words, this is then where the fire hasn't been covered or whatever it is, the conditions we've discussed. If it's one of the prohibited manners of chazara, or placing food, he says it would not be applicable to ask a non-Jew to have this heter of shvut to shvut. The einais isur netina ela mitziut matzav. The einais isur netina ela mitziut. The whole point was the Chachamim forbade us because you may come to stoke the coals, or you may come to do whatever. So that's going to apply whether I was the one who put it there, I wasn't the one who put it there, I put it there before Shabbat, whatever. But that forbidden result has been achieved. It doesn't matter who did it. If it was done artificially, right? If artificial intelligence did it, right? That a robot did it, I don't care. The point is that's a problem, according to the Chazon Ish. And therefore, that seemingly would translate into our case as well, regarding a timer. You have a look at number 56, this is the Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata. He says, K'deira uba ochel mevushal, be'elev Shabbat mutar litain otar al gabe kira chashmalit b'shah shezo eina mufelet. Okay, so he says, if I have a pot with cooked food inside, so on Erev Shabbat, and before Shabbat comes in, I can place that on top of the stove or electric fire, whatever it is, even though it hasn't come on yet. Okay, so long as the fire is covered, etc. Even if I placed it on before Shabbat, the time is going to make it come on Shabbat. He says that case is allowed. ולא יוריד רק דרמה גבי הקהילה ויחזינה בשבת לפני חיבור זרם החשמל. He says, however, to take it off and to put it, to put it back on Shabbat before the electricity comes on, that no. וכל שכן שבשבת עצמה אסור ליתן הקדרה על הקהילה אפילו בשעה שאין היא מופעלת ואפילו היא מכוסה. Okay, so he says on Shabbat itself to place the food. Now, all of this is talking about a situation where we don't have the conditions for Chazara. Meaning, if I have the ordinary conditions for Chazara, it's been covered, or if I'm talking about a blech or whatever it is, so then if I can put it back while the fire is on, so kal vachomer, I can put it off before the fire is on. But what he's talking about, is a situation whereby, let's say I don't have all the conditions. So let's say, right, if I hold regarding a hot plate. So if I follow those poskim who say that you cannot put food directly onto the hot plate, you have to have it with a separation. So then he would say, see, even though the hot plate's off right now, the fact that it's going to come on, I can't do it in the forbidden way. I have to still do it with a separation rather than put it directly on. If I follow those opinions that say that I can place it, like Rav Ovadia, Rav Dov Lior, others that we saw, that I can place it directly on the hot plate. So if I could do that when it's on, obviously I could do it when it's off as well. Now again, we're dealing with cooked food. The Yalkut Yosef over here, the other Sfarim are a little bit more lenient. He says the following. He says, Benoten, it's B'Shabbat, source number 57. Benoten B'Shabbat tafshil lach, shenit basher. I only say nit basher once, but it was, cooked a lot. Shenit basher kol tzoko agabe plata. So you have a food, a liquid food that was cooked, that was fully cooked, to place it on the plata. Im yesh lachush gam b'zeh lebishul achal bishul. That's the question. So he says, Le'nyan achash alti lamalan. So that is Osher Ovadia. Ve'shiv li sheladato yesh letzaded la'akel. Le'nyan tafshir lach muvashal kol tzoko. Okay, so this is so in other words, he says the following. If the case is I have the hot plate now, which is off, and it's going to come on later with a Shabbat timer, could I take a cold liquid food and place that on the hot plate? Certainly, if I can't place it on the fire because that's cooking, but could I put it on when it's off? So he says, according to Ovadia, this would be allowed. He says, Letzaref etzvat Rambam, ein bishul achal bishul gam b'davar lach. He says we would take into consideration here the Rambam who says that there is no bishul achal bishul even with the liquid food. It's only indirect. Okay, so that is quite a chiddush. That is a leniency of Rav Ovadia. Again, not everybody would agree with that. The Ashkenazi poskim are more reticent in terms of accepting that.
It's like enough because it's on a timer.
Yes, yeah. He's saying if it's to put it directly on the fire, he would say no. But he's saying here you have a number of factors together. Meaning the fact, like we started saying at the beginning, we hold, practically speaking, we consider that to be bishul achar bishul for liquid foods, right? And therefore we can't reheat the liquid food. But many of the Rishonim say that there's no prohibition. And add that to the fact, he quotes here the Rambam, but it's not just the Rambam, we know the other Rishonim who say that as well. And in a situation where it is indirect and it's grammar and the fire's not on, so therefore he would allow it. As I say, other poskim are more stringent about that. Okay, so that more or less concludes our discussion about Chazara. You can see a summary here on page 206 all the way through to page 210 about the different conditions and the different things that we've discussed. This brings us on to the third Zerad Rabbanan when it comes to Bishul. Right? We mentioned that there is Shehiyah, which is leaving food on a flame before Shabbat comes in. There is Chazara, which is putting the food back onto the fire on Shabbat. As we've seen, many similarities between Shehiyah and Chazara in terms of covering up the fire and what are the conditions and etc. And the third one, again, the third category, which is less prevalent today than it was once upon a time, which is Hatmana. Hatmana is insulating food, right? Again, nowadays we have hot plates and crock pots and all sorts of things, and slow cookers and warming drawers and all the rest of it, which, so we aren't, but sometimes a person may find themselves, chayalim that are out in the shetach, whatever it is, and they have a pot. They don't have any way of keeping it warm. So you take towels or whatever, and you wrap up the pot before Shabbat while it's hot in order to keep it hot. That is hatmana. That is essentially hatmana. So let's begin with a summary. I'm going to skip a little bit, change the order because it gets a little bit confusing. But let's go to page 219. Page 219, you have number 10 at the bottom is the Orchot Shabbat. which is a sefer we've quoted from before a number of times, a contemporary sefer on Hilchot Shabbat. And he gives a little bit of an introduction, a bit of a summary over here. The reason this gets quite complicated, we'll see, there's going to be a difference between Chazal differentiated between Hatmana from on Erev Shabbat and Hatmana on Shabbat. And they differentiated between different types of materials. There are those materials which are going to maintain the heat, and there are those materials which are going to add to the heat. Okay, classic example, what's going to add to the heat is coals, fire. That's going to increase the heat of the food. And there are a couple of different girsaot in the Gemara, and there are two different reasons given why there is a prohibition for that which increases heat, that which maintains heat. The Rishonim actually switch them around, so they understand slightly differently. But we'll see all of that. We'll see all of that in due course. But let's see. So source number 10, Yochot Shabbat, he gives a summary as follows. He says, "Inyana hatmana." What is hatmana? I wrap up the pot in which the cooked food is placed, or I wrap up the food itself. Okay, in order to maintain its heat or to increase its heat. Okay, over the page. Essentially, there are two different gzerot relating to hatmana. Each one has its own reason, and these together are going to give us the principle. So he says, number one, isur hatmana b'davar mosif. Okay, so we have a prohibition of hatmana on something which will increase heat. That I cannot wrap the pot with something which will increase the heat. Okay, so this is part of a decree that I might come to insulate with ashes that contain still hot coals. Right here in brackets, right? So I have these hot ashes, which I'm going to use to wrap up the pot, and there's still some coals in there. What's going to happen? I'm going to stoke the coals. I'm going to move it around, and that is going to be an Isur Torah of Havara. Since the source of the prohibition here is that you might come to stoke the coals, as we've seen by Shehiyah and others, that this is when am I going to come stoke the coals? Whenever. So if I insulate it in this way, even from Erev Shabbat, that's going to be forbidden. Okay, that reminds us a little bit of the Chazon Ish that we saw, but that's what he says. He says, just the reality of having it wrapped up, insulated in coals, so that causes this concern that's going to go even on Shabbat. So therefore, Chazal said, since if you insulate it in ashes and in coals, you might come to stoke it. So anything that is similar to the ashes, any material that's going to increase the heat, the Mishnah will see, lists a number of these. It's not so clear to us today exactly how some of these materials will add heat. But in any event, that is going to be a prohibition. So even if it's before Shabbat, to do hatmana in something that adds heat, that is going to be prohibited.
So you have an insulated blanket that's electric, put it on a Shabbos card. Is that similar to coals?
Yeah,
insulated blanket.
Yes.
Okay. So right now it's not creating heat, but it's on a Shabbos card.
You're using it to wrap up your food.
Yeah.
So it could be. So we're going to have to discuss. I mean, the truth is that some of the Rishonim have a case where you have something. Let's say I have my pot, which is on a tripod or on whatever, so it's got coals underneath, and then I wrap it up with something on top. So that's exactly the case you're saying. That's going to be a machlok Rishonim as to whether that is prohibited or not. It's going to relate to another question we'll see, which is you can see it on the top of page 221, which is partial insulation, which is hatmana b'miktzat. So what if I have, part of the pot is uncovered? Is that going to be? Is that still going to be part of the prohibition or not? But yeah, but that's exactly the case, and this is where it comes up. And nowadays you have the hot plate, and I have a blanket or a plata cover or whatever it is that goes on top. It would seemingly be at least a question of insulation. The post can discuss as well. What about a crock pot? You've got the pot that's inside; it's surrounded by something which is increasing heat. Okay, so these are all discussions. I'm not sure we'll get to them today, but maybe we'll get to them next week. But that is the first gzeira. that relate to something which is going to increase heat, and that applies even from before Shabbat. Okay, now case number 2, we say so if I wrap it up in something that does not add heat. Okay, היינו, שאסור לעטוף את הקדרה גם בחומר שאינו מוסיף על חומה, רק שומר על החום הקיים. Which just maintains the existing level of heat. טעם איסור זה נתפרש בגמרא, שמשום שחששו חז"ל שמא בשעה שיבוא אדם להטמין את הקדרה, ימצא שכבר נצטננה. Okay, so over here, this is a different gezerah. What are Chazal concerned about in this case? That you come along, that it's on Shabbat, okay, and now you come to insulate the pot. I.e., you had the pot heated up before Shabbat, it was on the stove, whatever. It came off. Now you were going to eat. You're going to eat now. You're not eating. Your guests aren't here. You're only going to eat a few hours later. Whatever it is. So you say, okay, now I want to maintain the heat. So now I'm going to come and I'm going to wrap it up. Aye, but what happens? You come. You say you want to maintain the heat, and you find actually the coals have gone out and the pot's already cold. Oh, so what do? You've got guests coming, right? That's what we've spoken about. This is the whole thing of Shema Yechadev Gechalim. Before you can even think. Right, the first thing is you got the guests. You can't serve cold food to the guests. What kind of a Shabbos meal? What kind of a Shabbos host gives cold food to the guests? Right, so you start eating things up. Wait a minute, Shabbat, you're not allowed to do that. Okay, person's so there. This is what Chazal were concerned about. At the time where you're going to come and insulate the pot, you discover, it's already cooled down. And since you want to have a hot food, you will now accidentally come along and actually turn the fire back on and heat up the pot. This is only going to apply, this prohibition only applies on Shabbat itself. But if it's before Shabbat, okay, so again, before Shabbat, if I heat up the pot, I can heat up the pot. There's no problem. So therefore, if it's a material that does not increase the heat, but it's a material that maintains the heat, that I'm allowed to insulate, I'm allowed to wrap it up before Shabbat. Here, with this gzera, our main concern is at the time that you're doing the hatmana, not what's going to happen afterwards. And therefore there's no problem of doing that before Shabbat. Okay, so let's just go back now and see this in the primary sources. Let's see how that's the conclusion. That's just to give a bit of background because it does get a little bit complicated. Let's see how it is in the Gemara. How the Gemara presents this gzera. So go back to page 215. That's source number 1. This is a Mishnah which should be very, very familiar to all of us. Okay, I'll read it and you'll see why it's familiar. It says, "Safek chashecha, safek ein chashecha, ein masrin tavadai, ve'ein matpinin takelim, ve'ein madlikin taneot, ve'masrin tadmai, ma'avin v'tomnin et hachamin." Okay, it's familiar because it's at the end of Perek Bamei Madlikin, which we say every Friday night. So it says the Mishnah over here, right, that when it's safek chashecha, safek ein chashecha, when it's bein hashmashot on Friday night, so ein masrin tavadai, ve'ein matpinin takelim, okay, we'll leave all that because that's not our discussion for now. But in other words, you can insulate during Bein Hashmashot. So Rashi explains over here what is the hatmana that is allowed, what is permitted. Source number 2 it says Tomnin et hachamin notnan b'kupa shamochin. Okay, you place it in a basket of feathers or soft material. Liyot chuma mishtamer b'hem. That's the point, right? That the heat is going to be maintained, not that the heat will be increased. Aval mishachashacha v'adai ein tonim b'hem kidim falsh b'gmara. As we see in the Gemara, once Shabbat has come in, you cannot insulate at all. Right? So that's it. Before Shabbat, you can insulate only in something which maintains the heat, does not increase the heat. On Shabbat, you cannot insulate even in something which just maintains the heat. Another Mishnah, source number 3, says Bameh Tomnin Ubameh Ein Tomnin. This is the 4th parak of Sechet Shabbat, parak Bameh Tomnin, right? So it says what can you use, which materials can you use to insulate, and what can you not use to insulate. And this is obviously talking about before Shabbat, because on Shabbat it's all forbidden. So it says, Lo b'zefet, v'lo b'zever, v'lo b'melech, v'lo b'sid, v'lo b'chol, ben achim, ben yeveshin. All these materials, which, again, the Gemara understands that they will increase the heat. As I say, it's not necessarily clear to us nowadays why that is, but that is what the Mishnah says. So here the Gemara explains, right, what are these two types of hatmana that we're talking about. Source number 4 says, Amar Rava, Ivnei mamru ein tomnin bedavar she'eino mosif hevel mishechashecha. Gzera shemayatiach. So says Rava, why do we say that you cannot do hatmana on something, even something that does not increase heat? Right? He says, because we're concerned that you might come to shemayatiach, you might come to heat up the pot once you see that it's cold. So he says, why don't we do that also during Ben Hashmashot? He says, no, we don't. Generally speaking, we assume that the pot will still be hot. It's just come off the fire. We don't extend the gzera to Ben Hashmashot. And then says the Gemara in source number 5. It says, right? Why do we say that even something which is which increases the heat, that even before Shabbat we can't do hatmana? Gzera shemight min b'remes shesh pagachelet. Right? As we saw, this is all to do with a gzera, that you might come to insulate something that has coals, and you might come to stoke the coals, and that will be a problem. Okay, as I said, the Rif, I won't go into it now. The Rif and the Rambam have a slightly different understanding of the Gemara. They sort of reverse the reasons. But in any event, so the Shulchan Aruch source number 8, again, we're back to page 219 where we started. Shulchan Aruch says, Ein tomnim b'Shabbat. This is the bottom line. We cannot insulate on Shabbat. Afilu b'davar she'ein mosif hevel. Even something that does not increase the heat, just maintains the heat. Aval b'sfek chashecha tomnim bo. During Ben Hashmashot, you could. Right, that's going to be the nafkamina between the two. We didn't go into all the technicalities, but depending on how you understand which reason applies to which gzera, the nafkamina is going to be whether you can do it during Bein Hashmashot. I'm not going to get into too many details, so it's not to get confusing. But it says we don't insulate on something that is going to increase heat, even before Shabbat. Okay, so that's the basic idea. That is the basic principle of hatmana. So let's start talking about maybe hatmana b'miktzat and see how this applies. Source number 11. Source number 11, the Shulchan Aruch, he says, Lasom kelim ala tafshil, kedei leshomo min ha'achbalim, או כדי שלא יתענף באפלולית, שלי שאין זה כמטמין לאחם, אלא כשומר ונותן כיסוי על הקדרה. Okay, so this is our first leniency, very, very important. It says the Shulchan Aruch. Essentially, when we talk about wrapping up the food or wrapping up the pot, we're talking about where you're wrapping it up in order to maintain the heat. But if I'm covering it for a different reason, in order to protect it from insects or something else, or so that it won't become dirty, right, to stop flies or mice or whatever it is, so that is not called hatmana, right? That's what he says here. I'm putting, aren't we glad that hygiene has advanced a little bit since the days of the Shulchan Aruch, right? But he says you're covering up your pot so that the mice that are running around your house all the time. We remember the mice from Masechet Pesachim, right? The Gemara talks about doing a b'digat chametz. But what happens if a mice runs into the house and you see the mice coming in with the bread, going out with the bread, or from one house to another, etc.? Okay, hopefully we're checking and there's no mice, and not just because of chametz. But in any event, you're covering up the pot so that the mice don't get to it. Or it doesn't become dirty, whatever reason. Then shali, that is permitted. That's like putting a lid on a pot, which you can do in order just to protect it. So the Ochot Shabbat says, therefore, he says, placing a lid on top of a pot, that's not called hatmana, even though the food inside is not completely covered, right? It's going to maintain the heat. No. Even if it's touching the food. Right? You just want to keep the food protected.
That's across the board?
What do you mean?
like that's not like, like, doesn't need like put on open, like cover a pot.
Yeah. Again, the thing about covering a pot, what we have to remember all the time, is if the pot is on the fire and the food inside is not fully cooked, we're here for a moment, but I think we're back. Okay, all right. Hope you didn't miss too much. Okay, now the next thing that comes up again is this idea of hatmana b'miktzat as well. This is what we spoke about a little bit earlier. So the Rabbeinu Hananel, source number 13, he brings the case as follows. He says, "Shihui ze eino hatmana, ela kagon kiseh shel barzel, v'akdera yoshevet alea, v'hitluya o ba'avanim, or kayotzeba." So you have a pot that's sitting on a kiseh shel barzel, sort of like a metal stand, and right, and the pot is over there. Avatmana al gabei gechalim. So he says that would be okay. Hatmana al gabei gechalim, divrei kol asur. Dekayim alan hatmana b'davar mosif hevel asur v'afilu mi'ba'od yom. He says if you have hatmana on coals, okay, there's going to be a large discussion here exactly what does this mean. If I have the pot on coals, okay, because seemingly that means that it's being the hatmana, the insulation, the heating up is coming from underneath, but it's not that I have coals all around it, right? So this is essentially the source of discussion relating to hatmana b'miktzat. It's partially insulated. See the Sefer Yashar. Sefer Yashar was written by Rabbeinu Tam. He says, "Chamin shelanu she'anu tomrim afa b'shesh svivotav me'at remetz kagova etzba ein kan isur hatmana mashma shemechusa ba urbo or kulo." Right, so says Rabbeinu Tam, he says, hatmana is what it sounds like. It says insulating. If I'm insulating a pot, it needs to be covered, at least most of it. At least, this is interesting, it's a urbo or kulo, right? At least most of it, but all of it. But if I just have a layer of coals underneath, right, even if it's extending a little bit upwards, that is not considered hatmana. Or Zarua, source number 15, he says, "Mashma milshono shel le'ashot agabei gechalim mamash asur." U'milshon Rashi. Right? Again, quoting that was the Rabbeinu Hananel. He said, "Hatmana al gabei gechalim." So therefore, and he says that implies that is forbidden. Aval vadai latmino betoch. Sorry. Then he says, "Mash afal gechalim mutar lishot ukvatei mistabra." Sorry. So meaning. No, that's Lashon Rashi. Meaning Rabbeinu Hananel says no. Okay, there should be a comma there. It says Lashon Rashi. From the language of Rashi, it sounds like that even on top of coals, you're allowed to place it, and therefore well, that seems reasonable. אבל ודאי להטמינו בתוך גחלים לצורך מחר, בה ודאי מסתבר כפירוש רבנו חננאל דאסור. דרכיים אלן דין טוענים בדבר מוסיף הבר. If you are inside the coals, surrounded by coals, that would be forbidden. Okay, so essentially what we see, what seems to be, is that we have a machloket rishonim, meaning if something is partially insulated, it's not completely clear exactly what the language, what Rabbeinu Hananel is referring to. Okay, you can see already there's some confusion amongst the Rishonim, and again, it would seem to be, if he's talking about a case where you just placing it on top of coals, so again, what's the hatmana? There's no hatmana there as well. Maybe he means to say that the coals are a little bit surrounding, it goes into the coals a little bit, I'm not sure. But certainly, what he's dealing with is where it's not fully insulated. Okay, it's partially insulated. So according to Rabbeinu Hananel, it seems to be that something which is partially insulated is still considered hatmana. According to the Ozara, the Sefer Yashar, something which is partially insulated is not considered. Okay, that's what we call hatmana b'miktzat. So the Shulchan Aruch, source number 16, and he says like this: Kol zeh binyan shektelai yoshev kol zeh. In other words, all the discussion of here he's talking about Shehiyah, but he says, that's where it's not touching the coals. Says the Shulchan Aruch, that is going to be forbidden. Okay, so maybe the point what Rabbeinu Hananel here is saying is that once it's touching the coals directly, even though it's just underneath, that's already considered hatmana. Okay, but what we see, the Shulchan Aruch says, the concept of hatmana b'miktzat, the concept of partial insulation is going to be forbidden. The Rama says, v'yesh omrim, dafilu im ha'ktela omedet, agabe ha'esh v'amash, i.e. the part is standing directly on, it's in contact with the fire. Kol zman shi meguleh, lemala lo mikra hatmana. So long as it on top, it is uncovered, that is not called hatmana. In other words, you can summarize, says the Rama, hatmana b'miktzat is not hatmana. Now, what does it mean when he says kol zman shi meguleh lemala, that is open on the top? Does it mean just the top? Is it enough that the top of the pot there's no lid on and then it's uncovered? Or does it mean that the sides have to be uncovered as well? So,
your problems, right?
What?
If it's unopened fire, then like if it's not happening now, it's like you've got other issues here already.
Because of right. Essentially, unless again, if we're dealing with there are cases of shehiyah where the food is fully cooked, etc., and then if you're allowed to leave it on the fire, but that's maybe essentially that's what Rabbeinu Hananel is coming to say. Meaning, everything we discussed when it comes to shehiyah and chazara, etc., and then I have to put into place mechanisms that I'm not going to come and stoke the coals. So he said, so maybe what he means to say is like this: the food's fully cooked, etc. So I'm not concerned that you're going to come to stoke the coals. This is Rabbeinu Hananel. Or that's the case where it's not directly in contact. When it's directly in contact with the coals, it's so close that again it's another step that's removed away, and therefore I'm going to be concerned for that as well. Just the Prima Gademia, source number 17. Right. So he says, Miu Shiur shekatav alav. That's the Rama. B'siman Rishon Gimel. Tavena dafka she'en megule lemala. I kavanato dafka shegam piek de'la mechuseh. Or dilma kol shekol ha'ktera tmuna af she'pia megule v'atmuna have. In other words, the question is, what does it mean when he says that it's not the entire pot that is insulated? Does it mean just the lid of the pot, or does it mean even if the sides, right? He's saying maybe the second possibility, which is in bold, Dilma kol shekol ha'ktera tmuna, all the sides of the pot are insulated as well. Af she'pia meguleh, even though the lid itself is uncovered, but maybe that's still called hatmana, according to the Rama. That's what it implies from the Taz. Over the pages, the Mishnah Berurah says, no, he says, in other words, the Mishnah Berurah understands, so long as the very top is not, as long as there's a part that's uncovered, that is not considered hatmana. Okay, maybe we'll stop there. We'll stop there for now, and we'll pick that up from next week. So again, this is we're leaving on the question of hatmana b'miktzat, of partial hatmana, which according to Shulchan Aruch is a problem, according to Rama is not a problem. We have to understand exactly what that means and its different applications. We'll get to the question of hatmana on a hot plate, and then other cases of kli sheni, insulating with food, etc. Okay, Adkan. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day, a good week. Next time.